Welcome to my 192nd video on my work with OO gauge. This part is going to be a little complicated. The basic subject is my attempts to get a model of a Stanier Black Five locomotive running on my Hornby Dublo 3-rail tabletop railway, by means of performing surgery on a modern Hornby model of a Black Five and combining it with the tender from a 3-rail 8F. I guess the first questions that I need to answer are, what the heck was I trying to do and why the heck did I want to do it? Let me take the second question first. What I choose as my primary prototype for my railway modelling is LMS operations before the Second World War, especially in the British Midlands. I grew up in Leicester. My grandfather, my dad's dad, drove for the LMS. Well, he had a long career, starting as a cleaner with the Midland Railway probably sometime in the 1880s. By 1909, he was a driver with the Midland living in Leicester, and he was a widower with 3 young daughters. He married my grandmother, who was herself a widow with a young son, and they went on to become the parents of 4 boys, of whom my dad was the second. My grandfather retired as a top-line driver with the LMS in the 1930s. Some of my family did continue to work on the railways into the time of nationalisation and British Railways, but the family's experiences with British Railways weren't the happiest. My uncle was killed in an accident whilst driving a steam loco in the 1950s, and getting compensation for his widow was a struggle for the family. Although it was undoubtedly based on fine aspirations, I don't have fond feelings about how British Railways actually worked out. So I choose to model what you might call the heyday of the LMS, which my grandfather spoke of with pride. Okay, a rather long-winded preamble, but the point is pre-war LMS operations are what I most like to model. Recently, I've become very involved in working with Hornby Dublo 3-rail, itself a historic model railway system at the heart of British modelling. But though it was conceived in the 1930s, Dublo 3-rail reached its greatest fruition in the 1950s, and Hornby very much focused on modelling contemporary railway reality. So they didn't really produce a great deal in Dublo 3-rail appropriate to modelling pre-war LMS. They did, of course, announce the Duchess of Atholl train set before the war, and that finally went into production in 1947 when Dublo production resumed. That set included the Duchess of Atholl locomotive, as originally built in LMS crimson livery and without smoke deflectors, and 2 tin-plate LMS mainline coaches. But not a lot else was really forthcoming in the way of LMS rolling stock. There was an LMS freight set that featured a brake van and 2 wagons in an approximation to the bauxite livery that the LMS started to use for freight stock from 1937. The loco in the set was, as I've referred to it before, the Dread N2, finished in LMS livery but not really passable as a model of any engine that the LMS actually used. I did finally give in and acquire a Dublo N2 in LMS livery, and it's an excellent little model and very functional despite not being really prototypical. Hornby didn't really come out with any other LMS stock, and from 1953 on they concentrated on producing stock in BR livery in tune with their policy of modelling contemporary railway reality. In 1958, they did come out with a model of the Stanier 8F. This model was only sold by Hornby in BR livery, see previous comments on policy, but nevertheless it was a real gift to those of us wanting to model the LMS, as the 8F is one of the most classic LMS designs, and converting the model from BR black livery to LMS black livery wasn't hard. I acquired my first 3-rail 8F as part of a G25 heavy freight train set, and I rebadged it as LMS. Just recently I acquired a second 3-rail 8F, which someone had already repainted in gloss black with LMS identification. Another somewhat more approximate candidate was the 00264 tank. This was actually modelled on the BR standard Class 4 mixed traffic loco, but that BR design itself was derived from a long line of LMS 264 tank designs from Fowler through Stanier to Fairburn. Hornby only ever sold the 264 tank in BR livery. But oddly enough, Wren did sell a 2-rail version of it in LMS livery after they acquired the tooling. I have a 264 tank with an LMS-marked body from Wren. I put an LMS-marked body onto a 00264 tank for running on my 3-rail tabletop. Beyond that, there's not really anything else that Hornby produced in 003 rail that could at all readily be pressed into LMS service. And that finally brings me back to the real subject of this video. I was lucky enough to pick up a Wren Royal Scot that had been converted for 3-rail operation. That left me wanting more than anything else in terms of core LMS locomotives, a Ginty and a Black Five. I couldn't see much to be done in pursuit of a Ginty. Hornby did produce the Southern R1 as a Dublo model, and being an 060 tank loco of fairly similar profile, that could be passed off as a Ginty if suitably refinished. A refinished R1 would look more like an actual LMS loco than the N2 ever did. But the Dublo R1 was only released as 2-rail. There never was a 3-rail version of it. Indeed, for most of the production life of 003 rail, no 060 chassis was made. Hornby did finally release the Class 8 diesel shunter in 3-rail as well as 2-rail towards the end of Dublo's time. But 3-rail Class 8s are scarce, and anyway that chassis wouldn't lend itself to merging with a Ginty body. But I did come up with a possible scheme for getting a Black 5 running on 003 rail. My thinking was that the 8F and the Black 5 were very similar, the 8F design basically being derived from the Black 5. Now, the 3-rail 8F works on the basis of having plunger pickups for taking power from the centre rail in the tender, and then passing that centre rail power to the loco via a wire from the loco plugged into the front of the tender. The loco picks up power from the outer rails through its wheels, and so the motor in the loco is driven. So I thought that it should be possible to combine a tender from the 3-rail 8F model with any loco-driven model of the Black 5, and with only fairly minor modification to the loco, get the combination to run on 003-rail track. I had a number of 2-rail 00 gauge Black 5 models, given that it's a very central LMS loco design, but most of them were tender-driven and so would be no help with this project. The only loco-driven Black 5 that I had was 5156 Air Shear Yeomanry, which I acquired as part of the 1945 Going Home train pack. That was a very nice model in pristine shape, and I didn't really want to start chopping it about to serve this project, so I kept my eye out for another loco-driven Black 5 model going at a reasonable price. And one did turn up locally, actually, which is always more economical for me than having to ship to Canada from the UK. I picked up this loco-driven model of a Black 5 from British Model Trains in Cambridge, Ontario, just up the road from where I live. It wasn't dirt cheap, but it was a better deal than I could have got buying a comparable model from the UK. This model was in the older style styrofoam packaging. It had some info about the class printed on the back of the covering card, as seen here. Here's the end of the covering card with the product info. R2257 was released in 2002, 20 years ago, making it one of the earliest loco-driven Hornby Black 5s, if not the earliest. Here's the model out of its packaging. Loco and tender are joined by means of a pin on the tender fitting into a drawbar on the loco. The drawbar has two electrical contacts, which make contact with different parts on the tender, so power from both rails is passed from tender to loco. Here's the model on my little test track. I tested it here first and confirmed that it was running well, which I would expect, as Nigel with British Model Trains services all the locos that he sells unless they're brand new. I got out my multimeter as I wanted to sort out electrical polarity issues before starting work on the necessary modifications to the loco. With the positive terminal of my meter connected to the right rail and the loco powered to go forward, I got a positive voltage reading. I then tested the polarity on my Dublo 3-rail track. With the positive terminal of my meter connected to the centre rail and power applied for forward motion, I got a negative voltage reading. This told me that the centre rail was providing the same polarity of power that was being provided to the left wheel of the loco in 2-rail operation. So, for 3-rail running, I would need to disconnect the left wheel pickups from the motor, connect those left wheel pickups together with the right wheel pickups to the other side of the motor, and then connect the power from the centre rail to the side of the motor to which the left rail pickups were originally connected. I got the Black 5 model into the servicing cradle on the workbench and tested it again with my bench power supply. I undid the screw and removed the front bogie. Then I unscrewed the body retaining screw that was under the front bogie, seen here. I removed the chassis from the body. It was a fairly typical modern chassis with a can motor, a cover over the worm, and a DCC socket at the front, fitted with a blanking plate. I tested the continuity between the contacts on the drawbar, which I had detached, and the wheels. I ascertained that the top contact on the drawbar was the one with continuity to the left wheels, so that was the one that I would want to pass power from the centre rail. I removed the DCC blanking plate. The DCC socket was 8-pin, and the blanking plate just shorted across the 2 outer pairs of pins. Here's a closer view of the PCB board with the screws retaining it already removed, as I was going to have to unsolder wires. The 2 corner connections that have 2 wires are the ones that come from the pickups. In each case, one of the wires comes from the loco pickups and one from the tender pickups via the drawbar. The connections that have only 1 wire are going directly to the brushes of the motor. The connection at the back left here is the one with the connections from the left loco wheel pickups and the corresponding wire from the drawbar. I wanted to desolder that one first so that I could remove the wire from the left loco pickups whilst retaining the wire from the drawbar, which I would subsequently connect to the 8F tender to get power from the centre rail. Here's the bottom of the PCB board, as it was when I first lifted it. Not exactly the neatest soldering job, even by my standards, but it was functional. I got my soldering station powered up, and also got out a desoldering pump as I wanted to suck some of that big blob of solder off as soon as I could. Just before I started to desolder things, I tried the Black 5 chassis on a standard Dublo 3-rail curve. The radius of these is only 15 inches, equivalent to modern first radius, so I was a bit concerned as to whether it would be possible for the Black 5 driving wheels to get round these curves. This experiment basically reassured me that it should be possible, even if it was going to be rather tight. So I went ahead with my soldering exercises. I got the PCB board into a clip of my helping hand. I melted the solder on the connection from the left pickups and sucked away some of it with my desoldering pump. Then I removed the connection from the left loco pickups from that hole, leaving just the wire from the drawbar connected there. Now I desoldered the opposite corner and removed the 2 wires from it, the other wire from the drawbar and the wire from the right loco pickups. Here's where I'd got to at this point. 1 wire from the tender drawbar was still soldered to the PCB board intended for passing the power from the centre rail. The other wire from the tender drawbar was now loose, held in my hand here. The wire from the left loco pickups was still loose at this point. I checked the continuity again to make sure that the wire from the tender drawbar was properly connected to the PCB board. Next, I wanted to get the wire from the left loco pickups connected in with the wire from the right loco pickups. Actually, I got confused as to which hole was which, and I soldered the wire from the left loco pickups directly in with the motor wire rather than in with the right loco pickup wire. But this really didn't matter for the functionality that I wanted, as the two sides would be connected across anyway by the blanking plate, and I had no intention of actually using the socket for DCC. It would be possible to put things back the way they were for two-rail running and even for DCC, but to do that my rewiring would need to be completely reversed. The way I had wired things, the Loco would immediately short the controller if powered up on two-rail tracks, but that's what you'd expect when the model was wired for three-rail operation. I screwed the PCB board back in place. I've labelled the wires here. As I said, I really meant to solder the wire from the left Loco pickups in with the wire from the right Loco pickups, but I soldered it in with the wire to the motor instead by mistake, and I did realise this mistake before going further, but I didn't bother to correct it, as it made no difference for my purposes, as when the blanking plate was in place all three wires would be connected together anyway. I put the blanking plate back in place and then tested again. I confirmed that I could power the Loco by applying power to the upper drawbar pickup and to a driving wheel on either side of the Loco. That was what I wanted, so both sides of the Loco would pick up from the side rails and pass to one side of the motor, and the wire from the tender would carry power from the centre rail to the other side of the motor. Next, I desoldered the wire from the upper contact of the tender drawbar, the wire that I had going to the PCB board. I could now set aside the tender drawbar with its other wire still attached, as I wouldn't be using that for my three-rail operation. Now I brought to the bench one of my three-rail 8Fs, the original one from the train set, which I had rebadged from BR to LMS. I unscrewed the 8F drawbar from the Loco and unplugged the wire from the front of the tender, so separating Loco and tender. I put the drawbar screw back into the Loco so that it wouldn't get lost. Actually, this isn't the original screw anyway, but it is the one that was fitted when I got the model. Here you can see the wire coming from the back of the Loco with its contact piece for fitting into the tender, and the square hole into which that fits is the bright blob on the front of the tender. I didn't want to steal the contact piece from the 8F, as I wanted to make it as easy as possible to switch the tender between use with the Black 5 and use with the 8F. So I wanted to make a new contact piece for use with the Black 5. I started by cutting a thin piece of brass sheet and bending it double. Then I ground my brass piece down to approximately the right thickness to fit into the tender. And I filed it some more until it would fit neatly into the hole in the front of the tender. I soldered my brass piece to the end of the wire from the PCB board. It turned out that this was a little premature, and anyway I didn't make a very good job of it. I tested the operation again, applying power to my brass piece and to the wheels of the Loco and confirming that the motor ran properly. Now I wanted to refit the body of the Black 5, and I realised that I had a problem. The wires to the tender drawbar originally went through a little slot at the bottom of the body at the back, but my brass contact wouldn't go through that slot, and anyway I really wanted it to pass through higher up. I decided to just drill a hole through the firewall of the Loco against the floor under the fire doors. I drilled a pilot hole with a 2mm bit in a pin vise, and then expanded that hole with a larger bit in an electric drill. This was the only thing that I did to the Black 5 model that couldn't be reversed. When I tried to pass the wire with my brass contact through the hole that I'd made in the Loco firewall, the brass contact fell off. But this didn't really matter, as I realised that the wire wasn't going to be long enough to reach to the tender anyway. I soldered a short piece of wire to the end of the original wire from the PCB board, covering the join with heat shrink, and then I soldered my brass contact to the end of that extension piece, making sure that I got it soldered on firmly this time. I got the chassis back into the body, with my wire with the brass contact coming out of the back. When I tested the running, it ran sort of okay, but it made a funny clicking sound. This was because I'd got one of the darn sanding tubes that project down from the Loco body on the wrong side of the connecting rod. There are sanding tubes that stick down on both sides, and they must go between the connecting rod and the main part of the chassis so that they can pretty much rub up against the wheels. I undid the body retaining screw again and refitted the body to the chassis with both sanding tubes in the right place. You can see them here at the right of this picture. Now I had to do something about connecting the loco and tender with a drawbar. I had thought that perhaps the original 8F drawbar seen at back here might work, but it wouldn't fit with the drawbar screw on the back of the loco, which I didn't want to change, because I'm trying to keep the changes to the loco as minimal as possible so they could be reversed if necessary. And anyway, the original 8F tender drawbar wasn't long enough. Because the Black 5 model had a fall plate and cab doors projecting backwards, I was going to have the tender a little further back to make proper running possible. I started to make a drawbar from a piece of brass sheet. Here are the loco and tender connected with my improvised drawbar. The wire from the back of the loco is now plugged into the front of the tender. I tested again, and the motor ran fine when power was applied to the loco wheels and to the plunger pickups on the tender. I got the Black 5 with the 8F tender onto my 3-rail tracks to try it. It ran fine on the straights, but derailed on the curves, which had me seriously worried for a few moments, as if the model couldn't get round the 3-rail curves, the whole project would be a failure, which I always knew was a possibility. But it turned out that the reason the model was derailing on the curves was that my improvised drawbar couldn't pivot properly at the loco end, which was causing pressure between loco and tender that was derailing the model. By trimming down and rounding off the loco end of the drawbar, I was able to get it to clear the raised sections of the loco chassis and to pivot properly. With that fix, I was able to run the Black 5 with the 8F tender round my 3-rail tracks. It basically ran pretty well, though when asked to turn over points, it needed to be taken rather cautiously to avoid derailing. Here's the Black 5 with the 8F tender, at bottom left here, together with my other 3-rail 8F at bottom right, and the Wren Royal Scot is in the station behind. So, after all this mucking around, let's finish with some actual running video of this Black 5. So, here is this hybrid Black 5 on the tracks on the 3-rail tabletop. This is the relatively modern Black 5 from 2002. Loco converted to take power from the 2 outside rails and a wire coming from the back, and then we got it hooked up to a tender from a 3-rail 8F, which is picking up from the center rail and passing the power forwards. And we'll turn the power up. There we go. Beg your pardon. One thing I'll say for it, it's pretty quiet, isn't it? These newer models do tend to be a bit on the quieter side. That's only 45% power, so that's not too bad. And it's running fairly quiet and smooth. The first time I tried to run it, it did derail, and I thought, oh, it can't get round the bends. But it turned out that was because my improvised brass drawbar between loco and tender wasn't pivoting freely enough, and that was causing derailments. When I improved the drawbar so it could pivot better, we got it to work, and it seems to be working fairly okay now. It's picking up, got lots of pickup from the outside, it's picking up from 6 driving wheels, all 3 driving wheels on each side from the outer rails, and then the center rail is picking up from the 2 plunger pickups on the tender. And that's running, as I say, about 45% power. It's pulling a heavier tender, of course, than it was intended to. So maybe now I'll get some coaches and try it with a couple of suburban coaches just to see how it can manage a train. Let's pause it there and we'll go and find some coaches and see if we can get it to pull a little train. Okay, now I've got that Class 5, that Black 5, railed up with a couple of Dublo suburban coaches in the station, but I'm not too confident this is going to work because the Black 5, although it does run fairly decently on the 3-rail track,
has a bit of trouble turning over the 3-rail points. It's a bit prone to derailing. It goes around the curves okay, and it'll go straight through the points okay, but trying to make it turn through multiple points, as it's got to do here to get out the stations, it's got to turn, it's got to come through a half curve, then turn through a point, then go straight through another point, turn the other way through another point. I'm not too sure whether it's going to manage to do that without derailing, but we'll try. See, it's a bit on the wobbly side. Ooh. No, it's not derailed, I don't think, but it's stopped. And it's not, although it looks as if it might be, it's not actually touching that. Yeah, see, this is a problem with it. That's a problem with those plunger pickups, I think, on the 8F tender. Oh, didn't really want to do that. No, I meant to go straight there. I didn't mean to have that point set to turn. I forgot to set this point straight. I don't even quite remember now. I've been doing so many funny things I can't even quite remember why I had it set to turn. But other points, just checking my other points, I think we're okay. So let's try again. See if we can run this train. So there he is, the Black Five with 2 suburban coaches. He stopped on the points a bit there, but he didn't actually derail on them. And now he's just going around, and I think, well, I'm not saying... Oh, he stopped again. Oh, he stopped and then he started again. I didn't do anything. I don't know what that was about. Why a train would stop and then start again without you doing anything. I don't know, usually you have to poke them or something if there's a poor contact. Yeah, he's a bit iffy going over the points, and I don't think that's not so much this Black Five arrangement that's to blame. He's got tons of pickups for the outside rails. All 6 of his driving wheels are contacting the outside rails. It's those plunger pickups on the 8F for the centre rail on the 8F tender that can be a bit iffy going over points if they don't hit the right spot, or if the right spot, see, he hesitates there, maybe because that point needs cleaning or whatever. We're still operating about 45%. I mean, I could make him go faster, but you know, he's running, which is a good sign. I mean, he's running the train at about the same speed he was running light engine. So I think we got, you know, a sort of a proof of concept there anyway. The Black Five does actually run, and he can actually pull a train, and I'm sure if he can pull a passenger train, he could pull a goods train as well. So I'm fairly pleased with that exercise.